The Georgia plantation of 1841 stood like a small kingdom unto itself, ruled by customs older than memory and laws written not only in books, but into the blood and bones of everyone who lived upon its land. Wide fields of cotton stretched toward the horizon, their pale balls glowing under the southern sun like silent witnesses to a system built on forced labor and unquestioned authority. The grand house sat elevated at the center, its white columns polished, its windows tall and watchful, as if the building itself were aware of its power. From a distance, the plantation appeared peaceful, even beautiful. But beneath that carefully maintained surface lived fear, silence, and suffering, realities that were never spoken aloud in polite society. The lady of the plantation had been born into this world of privilege and rigid expectation. From childhood, she was taught that her position placed her above others, that the people who worked the fields were property, not human beings in the same sense as herself. She learned to walk with grace, to speak softly, to smile at guests, and to never question the system that fed her wealth. Her education included music, reading, scripture, and manners, but it carefully excluded any lessons about compassion for those whose lives sustained her comfort. In this society, a woman like her was not encouraged to think deeply about injustice, only to uphold appearances. Yet despite the grandeur of her surroundings, her life was one of quiet confinement. The plantation was vast, but her world was small. Her days followed a predictable rhythm: mornings on the veranda, afternoons overseeing household matters, evenings filled with polite conversation or solitary reflection. Marriage, if it had come, had brought duty rather than affection, or perhaps it had not come at all, leaving her suspended in an unspoken expectation of obedience and restraint. In either case, her desires were irrelevant. A plantation lady was expected to be composed, loyal, and silent, carrying her loneliness like a hidden burden behind fine dresses and practiced smiles. Beyond the house, the enslaved community lived a very different reality. Their lives were ruled by bells, commands, and the crack of authority. Before sunrise, they were already awake, their bodies aching from the day before, their spirits weighed down by exhaustion. Men, women, and even children labored under the watchful eyes of overseers who enforced discipline without mercy. Punishment was public and deliberate, designed to remind everyone of their place. Freedom was not a concept they were allowed to imagine openly, though it lived quietly in whispered prayers and stolen moments of hope. The plantation lady saw them every day, yet she was trained not to truly see them. They passed through her world like shadows, serving meals, cleaning rooms, tending gardens. Always present, always invisible. Society demanded emotional distance. To acknowledge their humanity too fully was considered dangerous, even improper. Kindness could be mistaken for weakness. Empathy could blur boundaries that Southern law worked tirelessly to keep sharp and unforgiving. Religion played its role in reinforcing this order. Sunday sermons spoke of obedience and divine hierarchy, twisting scripture to justify cruelty. The lady was taught that slavery was not only lawful, but ordained, a natural condition that benefited everyone involved. These teachings were repeated so often that they became background noise, unquestioned truths that shaped thought before doubt could take root. And yet, sometimes, when the house was quiet and the heat pressed heavily against her skin, she felt a discomfort she could not name, a sense that something about this world was deeply wrong. Silence was the plantation's most powerful rule. Emotions that did not fit the accepted mold were swallowed and buried. Conversations avoided difficult truths. Any deviation from expectation invited scrutiny, gossip, and ruin. For a white woman of status, reputation was everything. One whisper could destroy her standing, her family name, her future. She learned early to guard her words and her expressions, to keep her inner life hidden even from herself. The structure of the plantation reinforced separation at every level. Physical spaces were divided: house and quarters, veranda and fields, table and dirt. Social interaction across these boundaries was strictly regulated. A glance held too long, a word spoken too gently, could invite suspicion. The laws of Georgia were unforgiving, especially when it came to relationships between white women and enslaved men. Such acts were considered monstrous, unnatural, and criminal. The consequences were severe and final, leaving no room for forgiveness. Yet human nature does not bend easily to rules, no matter how harshly they are enforced. Loneliness has a way of sharpening awareness. The lady's isolation made her sensitive to small details. The sound of footsteps on wooden floors, the rhythm of work songs carried on the wind, the fleeting expressions she caught on faces she was not supposed to notice. These moments were brief, almost accidental, but they lingered in her mind, longer than they should have. At night, the plantation changed. The noise of the day faded, replaced by insects, distant voices, and the low creak of the house settling into darkness. It was during these hours that thoughts became dangerous. Without the distraction of duties, she confronted the emptiness of her life and the strange pull she felt toward the world beyond her carefully drawn boundaries. She did not yet understand it, and she certainly did not speak of it. But something within her was stirring, quietly resisting the role she had been assigned. The enslaved people, too, lived with unspoken emotions. They knew the dangers of being noticed, yet they could not entirely erase their humanity. They loved, feared, hoped, and remembered lives stolen from them. They understood the plantation lady as a figure of power, distant and untouchable, yet still human in ways the system tried to deny. Every interaction carried risk. Every expression had to be measured. Survival depended on reading moods, predicting tempers, and remaining invisible when necessary. This was the world in which the story began, a place defined by control and contradiction, beauty built upon brutality, order maintained through fear. No one openly challenged the system, yet cracks existed beneath the surface. They appeared in moments of hesitation, in glances quickly averted, in the quiet discomfort that settled into hearts unwilling to fully accept the lies they were taught. The Georgia plantation of 1841 was not merely a setting, it was a force, shaping every choice and consequence. It dictated who could love, who could speak, who could live freely. And within this rigid structure, two lives moved unknowingly toward a collision that would test every rule the plantation stood for. Before love, before danger, before tragedy, there was this world, unchallenged, unforgiving, and silently waiting for something to go terribly wrong. He had been born into bondage, though no one could tell him the exact day his life truly began. Records were careless when it came to enslaved people, their births noted only when convenient, their names written and erased at the will of others. What he knew was the rhythm of the plantation long before he understood words like freedom or ownership. The fields taught him discipline. The overseer's voice taught him caution, and the quiet suffering of those around him taught him endurance. From a young age, he learned that survival depended on restraint, on knowing when to lower his eyes, when to speak, and when silence was safer than truth. Unlike many others, he had been assigned work closer to the big house. His strength was undeniable, but it was his intelligence that set him apart. He listened carefully, learned quickly, and understood the unspoken rules of the plantation with frightening clarity. He noticed patterns, how moods shifted, how power moved, how a single mistake could change a life forever. This awareness made him valuable, but it also made him dangerous in the eyes of those who believed enslaved men should remain simple, obedient, and unseen. The lady first noticed him, not because he stood out, but because he did not. While others moved with hurried fear or exaggerated humility, he carried himself with a quiet steadiness. His posture was respectful, his movements controlled, yet there was something in the way he listened that suggested depth rather than submission. When he entered a room, he did not rush to draw attention, nor did he shrink entirely into the background. He existed somewhere in between, a presence that lingered longer than expected. At first, her awareness of him felt accidental. A glance caught too late, a moment of stillness when he passed through the hallway carrying linens or delivering messages. Shh. He told herself it meant nothing. On a plantation filled with dozens of enslaved workers, it was only natural to recognize a face, yet his face stayed with her in a way that unsettled her. Not because of desire, she would not have allowed herself that thought, but because of a quiet curiosity she could not explain. He, on the other hand, noticed her with the instinct of someone trained to read danger. The lady was not cruel, but kindness carried its own risks. He observed the careful distance she maintained, the way her voice softened when speaking to certain servants, the hesitation that sometimes flickered across her expression. Unlike others of her class, she did not look through him as though he were part of the furniture. She looked at him briefly, then away, as if afraid of what acknowledgement might imply. Their early interactions were minimal, bound by strict social codes. A request made, a task completed. Words exchanged were practical, stripped of warmth or familiarity, and yet within these narrow limits, something subtle began to form. It lived in the pauses between sentences, in the timing of footsteps, in the moments when their paths crossed unexpectedly. Each encounter was brief, but it added weight to the next, building an awareness that neither fully understood nor dared to confront. The plantation was a place where every action was observed, yet paradoxically, true understanding was rare. People saw what they expected to see: a lady issuing instructions, a slave obeying orders. No one looked closely enough to notice the slight change in rhythm when they spoke, or the way silence stretched just a heartbeat longer than necessary. These details were invisible to those who believed they already knew the story. For him, the danger was immediate and real. He understood better than anyone what such attention could cost. The history of the plantation was filled, led with warnings, men beaten for perceived insolence, families torn apart over rumors, lives destroyed by the mere suggestion of impropriety. He reminded himself daily of the boundaries he could not cross. Whatever he felt, whatever he sensed, had to remain buried deep within him, locked away alongside countless other stolen possibilities. Yet restraint did not erase awareness, it sharpened it. He noticed the way her voice changed when she was tired, the subtle tension in her hands when guests filled the house, the loneliness that seemed to follow her even in crowded rooms. These observations were not intentional acts of intimacy, they were the result of proximity and attentiveness. Still, they created a quiet connection, one rooted not in spoken words but in shared humanity. She too struggled with the confusion growing inside her. In the evenings, when she reflected on her day, she found herself thinking of moments that should have been forgettable. She questioned why they lingered in her mind. It was unsettling to realize that someone she had been taught to see as property had become an individual in her thoughts. This realization frightened her more than she cared to admit. It threatened the carefully constructed beliefs that had shaped her entire life. The world around them offered no language for what was happening. There were no stories that framed such awareness as anything other than scandal or sin. She could not speak of it to friends, nor could she confide in family. To do so would invite suspicion, perhaps worse. So she remained silent, attempting to suppress the thoughts that surfaced unbidden, telling herself they were the result of boredom or loneliness rather than something deeper. Days passed, then weeks, and familiarity grew in small, almost invisible ways. He anticipated her needs before she voiced them, not out of affection, but survival. She seemed me to expect his quiet efficiency, the calm presence he brought to an otherwise restless household. These expectations formed a fragile thread between them, one that could snap at any moment yet somehow endured. What neither of them realized was how profoundly this awareness was changing them. For him, it was a reminder of his own humanity, something the system worked tirelessly to erase. Being seen, even briefly, as more than a tool stirred emotions he had learned to suppress. For her, it was the first crack in a worldview built on hierarchy and denial. Recognizing him as an individual forced her to confront questions she had never allowed herself to ask. The plantation continued its routines, indifferent to the quiet transformation unfolding within its walls. Fields were worked, meals were served, orders were given and obeyed. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Yet beneath the surface, the rigid roles that defined life there were beginning to blur, not through rebellion or defiance, but through something far more dangerous: understanding. Every shared moment carried risk, not because of what was done, but because of what was felt. In a society where control depended on distance, closeness of any kind was a threat. Neither of them chose this awareness, yet neither could entirely escape it. It existed in the air between them, unspoken and unresolved, shaping their thoughts and actions in ways they did not yet fully grasp. This was not yet love, nor even desire in its clearest form. It was something quieter and more unsettling, a recognition that defied the plantation's logic, a realization that beneath imposed roles and enforced silence, two human lives were intersecting in ways the world around them could neither permit nor understand. And once such recognition takes root, it rarely remains contained for long. What had begun as awareness slowly deepened into something far more dangerous, something neither of them had words for and neither dared to name. It did not arrive suddenly or dramatically, but grew in quiet moments, feeding on restraint and silence. In a world where every boundary was enforced by violence and law, emotion itself became an act of rebellion. The closer they came to understanding what stood between them, the more impossible it seemed, and yet the more impossible it became to ignore. For her, the realization was terrifying. She had been raised to believe that love followed rules, that it was permitted only within carefully chosen marriages, bound by race, class, and social approval. What she felt did not resemble the romantic ideals she had read about in novels or heard whispered among other women. It was deeper, heavier, and burdened with fear. It came with shame before it brought longing, and guilt before it brought warmth. She found herself fighting her own thoughts, scolding herself for weakness, praying for clarity that never came. She tried to return to the comfort of certainty. She immersed herself in household duties, in social visits, in scripture and routine. Yet even as she surrounded herself with noise and obligation, her mind betrayed her. She noticed his absence more than his presence. When he was assigned elsewhere, the house felt unsettled, as though something essential had been removed. This realization frightened her more than any rumor ever could. Dependence was dangerous. Attachment was unforgivable. He too felt the weight of what was happening, though his fear carried a sharper edge. For him, consequences were not abstract or social. They were physical, immediate, and often irreversible. The laws of Georgia were explicit. An enslaved man accused of impropriety with a white woman faced brutal punishment, even death. Truth did not matter. Intent did not matter. Survival demanded absolute caution. And yet, knowing the danger did not erase the feeling that had begun to grow quietly inside him. He did not seek her attention. If anything, he tried to pull away. He kept his eyes lowered longer than before, shortened conversations, requested reassignment when possible, but avoidance brought its own pain. Distance did not protect him from feeling, it only sharpened it. Every effort to forget only made him more aware of what he was trying to lose. He hated himself for the risk his emotions posed, not only to his own life, but to the fragile stability of those he cared about among the enslaved community. Their connection existed almost entirely in silence. They did not exchange confessions or promises. There were no stolen touches, no whispered declarations. The danger was too great. Instead, it lived in moments that could be explained away if questioned. A pause before speaking, a shared understanding when words failed, a look that lingered just long enough to be noticed only by the two of them. These moments were small, but in a world built on denial, they carried enormous weight. She began to see the plantation differently through this awareness. The routines she had once accepted without thought now felt unbearable. She noticed the exhaustion in the workers' bodies, the quiet grief in their songs, the way joy was rationed like a rare and fragile thing. The system she had been taught to defend now stood exposed in her mind as cruel and inescapable. Loving him, if that was what this was, meant confronting the truth about her own position within that cruelty. This realization brought her no peace. Instead, it fractured her sense of self. She was trapped between what she felt and who she was expected to be. To acknowledge her emotions fully would mean acknowledging the injustice that allowed her comfort at the cost of his suffering. It would mean admitting that the laws she lived under were not merely flawed, but monstrous. Such thoughts were dangerous even in private. She learned to hide them as carefully as she hid her feelings. For him, love was inseparable from pain. Every moment of connection reminded him of what could never be. Even if the world were different, Even if laws did not exist to forbid them, freedom itself stood between them like an unbridgeable distance. He belonged to a system that denied him ownership of his own body, his time, his future. How could love survive in such conditions? How could it exist without becoming another form of suffering? And yet, despite all logic, it did exist. It grew not because it was allowed, but because it was forbidden. It was shaped by restraint, strengthened by sacrifice, and defined by what could never be spoken. This was not a love that dreamed of shared futures or public acknowledgement. It was a love that lived entirely in the present moment, fragile and fleeting, yet profoundly real. There were nights when she lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of the plantation, imagining a life that could never be hers. She wondered who she might have been if she had been born into a different world, one where love was not dictated by law and violence. These thoughts brought no comfort. They only deepened her sorrow, reminding her of the walls that surrounded her, invisible yet unbreakable. He too lay awake at night, staring into darkness, wrestling with emotions he had never been allowed to explore. Love was a luxury he could not afford, yet it had found him anyway. He feared that even carrying it silently within him was a risk, that something would betray him in his posture, his voice, his silence. Fear became his constant companion, entwined with longing in a way that left him exhausted and hollow. The plantation did not pause for their inner turmoil. Life continued, nude with relentless indifference. Guests arrived, overseers barked orders, seasons changed. The world remained the same, even as they changed within it. This contrast made their feelings feel unreal at times, as though they were imagining something that could not truly exist. But the pain they felt was real, undeniable, and growing. There were moments when she considered confessing, not to him, but to someone else, perhaps a trusted friend or a priest. Each time, fear stopped her. Confession would not bring understanding, it would bring judgment and ruin. She would be forced to deny everything, to punish him, to protect herself. The thought sickened her. Loving him meant protecting him, even if that protection required silence and self-denial. He understood this instinctively. He knew that if suspicion ever fell upon her, she would be pressured to distance herself in ways that could destroy him. This knowledge shaped his actions more than his own fear. He cared not only for his survival, but for hers. In this way, love became another burden, another responsibility carried quietly and alone. The cruel irony was that what bound them together also kept them apart. Their awareness of the danger made them careful, but it also intensified their emotions. Every safe distance felt like a loss. Every moment of restraint felt like a sacrifice. They lived in constant tension, balancing on the edge of discovery without ever crossing it. This was a love without escape. There was no path forward, no acceptable outcome. To act on it was to invite destruction. To deny it was to endure quiet suffering. They existed in a painful in-between, sustained by brief moments of connection and haunted by the certainty that it could not last. In the end, it was not passion that defined their bond, but endurance. The ability to feel deeply while doing nothing. The strength to carry love as a secret, knowing it could never be claimed. In a world that denied their humanity in different ways, this forbidden love affirmed it at a terrible cost. The plantation had always been a place of watchful eyes, but as time passed, those eyes seemed to sharpen. What had once felt like routine observation now carried an edge of suspicion, as though the air itself had grown alert. On a plantation, nothing remained hidden forever. Too many lives moved too closely together. Too many hierarchies depended on control. Secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, had a way of leaving traces behind. It began subtly. A servant lingered in a doorway a moment too long. An overseer paused his stride, watching rather than commanding. Conversation stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. No accusation was spoken aloud, but the silence changed. The plantation lady sensed it first. She had been trained to read social undercurrents, to recognize shifts in mood long before words followed. Something was wrong. The familiar comfort of authority now felt brittle, as though it could crack under pressure. She noticed how often her actions were observed. A request made to one servant rather than another. A moment spent too long near the back of the house. These were ordinary choices, yet they suddenly seemed charged with meaning. She began to second-guess herself, altering routines, forcing distance where it had not existed before. The effort exhausted her, but fear kept her vigilant. On a plantation, reputation was armor. Once it fractured, it offered no protection at all. For him, the danger arrived more quickly and with less warning. Among the enslaved community, rumors moved like wildfire, carried in whispers that traveled faster than footsteps. A glance noticed by the wrong person, a pattern observed by someone with nothing to lose. He sensed the change in how others looked at him, not why. Accusation, but with concern. Some avoided him altogether, afraid that proximity might bring trouble. Others watched him carefully, trying to understand what they could not say aloud. The overseer, a man who prided himself on control, began to pay closer attention. He noticed efficiency that bordered on familiarity, confidence that did not match expectation. Enslaved men were meant to move quickly, to respond without thought. Any deviation from this norm drew suspicion. Intelligence was tolerated only when it served unquestioningly. Awareness was dangerous. He adjusted his behavior immediately. He slowed his steps, avoided the house when possible, accepted harsher tasks without complaint. He became smaller, quieter, more invisible. Yet invisibility was not enough once doubt had taken root. Suspicion did not require proof. It required only the possibility of disruption. And nothing threatened the plantation's order more than the suggestion of blurred boundaries. Within the enslaved quarters, fear spread quietly. History had taught them what such suspicion could bring. Punishments were rarely contained to one person. A single accusation could justify collective suffering. Whippings increased. Workdays grew longer. Small privileges were withdrawn without explanation. The message was clear. Someone had stepped out of line, and everyone would pay until order was restored. The lady felt the weight of this unrest, even if she did not fully understand its cause. She heard fewer songs from the fields. The house grew tense, servants more withdrawn. Guilt pressed heavily on her chest, though she had done nothing by the standards of law. And yet, she knew. She knew that her emotions, carefully hidden as they were, had consequences far beyond herself. Guests began to arrive more frequently, invited under the guise of social obligation. These visits were not accidental. They were inspections disguised as politeness. Friends and relatives watched her closely, noting her demeanor, her conversations, her composure. Questions were asked casually, but their intent was sharp. She answered carefully, maintaining the image expected of her, smiling through the unease that tightened her throat. He sensed her fear even when she said nothing. The distance between them grew, enforced now not only by caution but by circumstance. Tasks were reassigned. Paths that once crossed no longer did. When they did see each other, it was brief and public, their expressions carefully neutral. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with unspoken warnings and restrained emotion. Then came the betrayal, not dramatic, not loud, but devastating in its quiet inevitability. It did not come from malice alone, but from fear, ambition, and the need for survival. Someone spoke. Perhaps it was a servant seeking favor. Perhaps it was an overseer interpreting patterns as truth. Perhaps it was a neighbor eager to assert moral superiority. The source hardly mattered. Once suspicion was voiced, it gained a life of its own. The lady was summoned under the pretense of concern. The conversation was gentle at first, filled with reassurances and false sympathy. She was reminded of her position, her responsibilities, the importance of maintaining order. Then came the questions, carefully phrased but unmistakable in their intent. Had she noticed anything unusual? Had any servant behaved improperly? Was there anyone she felt particularly comfortable around? She understood then that the choice before her was cruel and absolute. To deny everything was expected. To show hesitation would be interpreted as guilt, and guilt, even unproven, demanded consequences. The system would not punish her openly, it would punish him. It always did. Her safety depended on his suffering. Her voice did not tremble as she answered. Years of training held her steady. She denied knowledge, denied impropriety, denied even the possibility of wrongdoing. Each denial felt like a betrayal, yet she knew it was the only way to protect him, however imperfectly. To confess would not bring mercy, it would bring violence. For him, the reckoning came swiftly. He was questioned not with words, but with authority. His movements were restricted, his work scrutinized, every action interpreted through the lens of suspicion. He understood what was happening without explanation. He had seen it before. The plantation had decided that an example might be necessary. Among the enslaved community, fear turned into quiet despair. They knew what came next, even if they did not know who would suffer most. Mothers pulled children close. Men avoided eye contact. No one spoke his name aloud. Silence became both shield and sentence. The lady watched helplessly as control tightened around the plantation like a noose. She wanted to intervene to assert her authority, but she understood the danger of drawing attention. Any display of concern would be misread. Compassion itself could become evidence. She was trapped by the very power that once protected her. When punishment came, it was public, deliberate, and merciless. It was framed as discipline, as restoration of order. The overseer's voice carried across the fields, sharp and unquestioned. She did not witness it directly, but she heard it. The sudden stillness, the muffled cries, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. Each sound cut into her, leaving wounds no one could see. For him, pain became a language he knew too well. He endured it not only for himself, but for her, for the others, for the fragile hope that his suffering might end the suspicion. He did not cry out her name. He did not look toward the house. He knew that any sign, connection would seal both their fates. Afterward, nothing returned to normal, though everyone pretended it had. The plantation resumed its routines, but something essential had been broken. Trust, once fractured, did not heal. The lady moved through her days like a ghost, haunted by the knowledge of what her silence had allowed. He moved through his with scars that marked more than his body. Whispers faded, replaced by a heavier silence. The lesson had been delivered, order for now was restored. But beneath the surface, resentment and sorrow festered, shaping futures in ways no one could predict. The forbidden bond had not been exposed in the way scandals often were. There were no confessions, no trials, no public acknowledgments. Instead, it was crushed quietly, efficiently, as the plantation crushed anything that threatened its authority. Love had not been named, but it had been punished all the same. And in that punishment, the truth became undeniable. On this land, innocence offered no protection, and silence was never neutral. After the punishment, the plantation settled into a version of calm that felt heavier than chaos. Order had been restored, at least on the surface, but it was the kind of order that came after something sacred had been destroyed. The fields were worked, the house was maintained, and commands were obeyed, yet nothing moved with the same rhythm as before. The air itself seemed burdened with memory, as though the land had absorbed what had happened and refused to let it go. He survived, but survival came at a cost that could not be measured in scars alone. His body healed slowly, each movement a reminder of the price paid for a bond he had never spoken aloud. Pain became a constant companion, but it was the quiet erasure that hurt more deeply. He was no longer assigned near the house. His presence was deliberately pushed to the edges of the plantation, as if distance could undo what had already occurred. This separation was not mercy, it was containment. Among the enslaved community, he became a symbol of warning rather than defiance. No one blamed him, but fear reshaped how they treated him. Conversations softened when he approached, eyes lowered, not in judgment, but in sorrow. They understood what the plantation demanded: forget, move on, survive. Remembering too openly was dangerous. Grief, like love, had to be carried quietly. For the plantation lady, life continued outwardly unchanged, but inwardly she was fractured beyond repair. Her reputation remained intact, preserved by denial and silence, yet it felt like a hollow victory. The house that once represented comfort now felt like a prison built from guilt. Every familiar space reminded her of what she had lost, not just him, but the version of herself that had briefly existed when she allowed her heart to see beyond imposed boundaries. She moved through her days with practiced composure, receiving guests, overseeing affairs, performing the role expected of her with flawless precision. Those around her praised her strength, her dignity, her ability to weather unrest without faltering. They did not see the weight behind her eyes or the way her hands sometimes trembled when she was alone. They did not hear the conversations she replayed endlessly in her mind, searching for a moment where she might have chosen differently. At night, sleep abandoned her. In the silence, memories surfaced unbidden. The sound of his footsteps, the quiet steadiness of his presence, the unspoken understanding they had shared, these memories brought neither comfort nor relief. They were reminders of a truth she could never undo. She had loved someone the world would never allow her to love, and that love had cost him dearly. She told herself she had done what was necessary. That silence had been protection. That denial had spared him worse suffering. Yet doubt gnawed at her relentlessly. Had her restraint truly saved him, or had it merely allowed the system to punish him without consequence? There were no answers, only questions that refused to fade. Time, as it always does, moved forward. Seasons changed. The cotton was planted and harvested again. New routines formed over old wounds. To outsiders, the incident became little more than a vague memory, a brief disturbance quickly absorbed by the plantation's relentless need for order. But for those who had lived it, time did not heal, it only buried. Eventually, word came that he would be sold. The decision was framed as practical, even generous. Removing him from the plantation would prevent future unrest, the overseer claimed. It would be better for everyone. The lady heard this news in silence, her expression unreadable, her heart shattering in ways no one could witness. She understood what sale meant. It was not merely relocation, it was erasure, a permanent severing of what little remained. She considered intervening. The thought burned within her like a final spark of rebellion. As the mistress of the house, she held influence. A word from her could delay the sale, perhaps even prevent it. But influence had limits, especially when suspicion still lingered. Any attempt to protect him now would reopen questions better left buried. The system that had spared her once would not hesitate to turn on him again or on her if provoked. He learned of the sale without surprise. Enslaved people lived with the knowledge that separation was inevitable, that no bond was permanent. Still, this knowledge did not soften the blow. Being sold meant leaving behind the only world he knew, however cruel it had been. It meant abandoning what little sense of familiarity and community he had age to preserve, and it meant leaving her knowing he would never see her again. On the morning of his departure, the plantation gathered as it always did when property changed hands. There were no speeches, no acknowledgments of loss. He stood among others, restrained not by chains but by certainty. He did not look toward the house. He did not allow himself that final act of weakness. To look could be to invite memory, and memory was a luxury he could no longer afford. She watched from behind a window, hidden by curtains, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might betray her. She memorized his outline, the way he stood, the strength still evident despite everything. She wanted to speak his name, to call out, to acknowledge what had existed between them, if only for a moment. But she remained silent as she always had. Silence was the only gift she was allowed to give. When he was gone, the plantation felt emptier in a way that could not be explained. Life continued, but the absence lingered, shaping every corner of her existence. She carried that absence with her. In all the years that followed, it followed her into conversations, into prayers, into dreams she could never fully escape. He was taken south, then further still, sold again as plantations changed hands and fortunes shifted. His life became a series of endings and beginnings he had no control over. Yet the memory of her remained, not as a source of longing, but as proof of something vital. In a world that worked tirelessly to strip him of identity, that brief forbidden love affirmed his humanity. It reminded him that he had been seen, truly seen, even if only for a moment. As years passed, the story faded into obscurity, swallowed by history's preference for power over truth. There were no records of their bond, no letters, no confessions. Officially, nothing had happened. The plantation stood, slavery endured, and society continued to justify itself with lies polished by tradition. But the consequences of that forbidden love did not disappear. They lived on in quiet ways. in the lady's withdrawal from the world, in her refusal to fully engage with the life expected of her. They lived on in the man's resilience, in the way he carried dignity through suffering, in the humanity he refused to surrender despite everything taken from him. Their story did not end with triumph or justice. It ended as most such stories did, with loss, separation, and silence. Yet within that silence existed a truth the system could never fully erase. Love had crossed a boundary it was never meant to cross. It had exposed the cruelty at the heart of a world built on ownership and control. In the end, their forbidden romance did not change the laws of Georgia or bring down the institution that destroyed them. But it left behind something quieter and more enduring, a reminder that even in the darkest systems, human connection survives, however briefly, however painfully. And though history may never record their names, the tragedy of their love speaks to every life shaped by injustice. It stands as a testament to what was lost, what was denied, and what could never be reclaimed except in memory, where it remains undiminished and unresolved.